Hello out there. We're on the air. It's Viper Bites tonight, presented by the Fantasy Points Media Group. Head to fantasypoints.com today. Enter promo code VIPERS22 and get 10% off that subscription right now. Now, we're going to continue our little series here, taking a look at the top 5 fantasy football assets for each of the 32 teams of the National Football League. And now we take a look at the Pittsburgh Steelers, led by Najee Harris. You've seen him in the top 3 in all Dynasty rankings as it comes to the running back position. Currently, the experts have him as the number 2 running back on the board. Even with a porous offensive line in front of him, Najee Harris's fantasy production saw him finish as the overall RB3 with 300.7 fantasy points a season ago, averaging 17.7 fantasy points per game. Volume is king for fantasy, and volume is certainly what Najee Harris received last season and what he's going to see in the very near future as well. Opportunity leads to points, especially in fantasy, and an 86.4% opportunity share certainly did so for Harris a season ago. Harris had, ready for this, 381 touches last year, 307 of them on the ground, and another 74 in the passing game on 94 targets. Those 381 touches were the most last season. It's crazy to think back in 1984 when a man named James Wilder had 492 touches for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, regardless of whether Trubisky or Pickens is under center in 2022, Harris will be dependent on to shoulder the load once again. Mike Tomlin has gone on record as saying Harris is going to be a bell cow for them. Boy, we love to hear that in fantasy, don't we? Which seems rather obvious when you have Benny Snell and Anthony McFarland next in line for touches. Now, one receiver who got plenty of touches last season was Deontay Johnson, who's just on the outside looking in top 12 territory here at the wide receiver position. Johnson saw a healthy target share last season that was over 25%, in which was probably helped out to a degree by the injury to Juju Smith-Schuster and Ben Roethlisberger's lack of ability to throw more than 10 yards down the field. Well, it seems improbable that Johnson's going to see 169 targets with perhaps the third best receiver in the league, his words not mine, Chase Claypool, and rookie George Pickens in the fold. Johnson's average depth of target last season was 8.2, and that's with Ben Roethlisberger under center. Now, I would expect that the targets and the receptions, that's going to take a little bit of dip this season, but that ADOT as well as that yards per reception, that's likely to increase in 2022. Johnson saw his yardage increase in each of the 3 seasons so far. Look for him to continue to win versus single-man coverage and watch that yardage continue to add up moving forward. Now, I mentioned Chase Claypool as a top 3 wide receiver in the league. His words again, not mine, definitely not mine. I'm not even sure he's a top 3 receiver on this team, to be honest with you. But hey, he still has some fantasy value, and we still need to talk about it. Claypool looked to be an asset in decline after seeing his touchdown totals decline from 9 back in 2020 to just 2 in 2021. But that was really the only significant bump that we saw there. His targets, his receptions, and his yards all nearly stayed the same. And his yards per reception actually increased from 14.1 to 14.6. Now, something to keep an eye on is where they decide to use Claypool. Both Johnson and Pickens are primarily perimeter type receivers. Perhaps a move to the slot is in Claypool's future, which is something of a need in Pittsburgh with the loss of Juju Smith-Schuster. Fantasy managers need to follow the money here as well. By the sounds of everything going on Pittsburgh could potentially let Johnson walk after the season due to all these wide receivers making all this money here, all these big deals this previous offseason. Claypool sees himself in a final year of a contract, but he's likely to be asking a lot less in a new contract than Johnson will be asking for. Johnson just turned 24, and this is likely as low as we'll ever see his value in a long time. Buy low, sell high. Now let's talk about another player riding high after last season. That's Pat Freiermuth. Move! Tight end 8 in Dynasty per experts here right now. Freiermuth didn't see more than 5 targets in a game until week number 6 against Seattle. From that contest on, he would see at least 5 targets in 8 of the final 12 games, including the playoffs, with 20 of those targets coming in the red zone. With the way the tight end landscape has looked the last few seasons, 60 receptions, 497 yards, and 7 touchdowns, that looks pretty darn good. Using that week 6 to 18 period there, Freiermuth was the tight end 9 in fantasy, averaging 11.3 fantasy points per game, seeing a 67.7% snap share and a 15.8% target share while finishing the season as a top 8th at the position in fantasy points per snap, 0.23. That's just the floor for Freiermuth. A good tight end is always a quarterback's best friend. Now, speaking of that young quarterback, Kenny Pickett, honorable mention to George Pickens here, who's currently the wide receiver 76 in Dynasty, the 203rd overall player who could very easily supplant both Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool in 2 to 3 seasons in this Pittsburgh Steelers offense, especially considering their contract situations and how that could potentially play out. Now, Pickens joins the Steelers with plenty of quarterbacking experience, having been the starter down the road at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, while at the University of Pittsburgh, he basically broke all of Dan Marino's Pitt records. Last season, the Steelers used a short passing game to propel themselves to the 4th most passing attempts per game, 43.9, while Pickett was completing 67% of his passes in college on his way to a 42 touchdown season. No one cares about your hand size when you're handing out them fantasy points. Just keep that in mind. And if we're going to hand out fantasy points, we're going to go to fantasypoints.com. Use the promo code Vipers22 and get 10% off that. That's like basically Kenny Pickett, 10% off a hand size, 10% off that fantasy point subscription. If you're watching us here on the Vipers Network, take a second, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and make sure those notifications are turned on because we got plenty more content coming at you every single day right up until kickoff. We'll see you next time.